This was the first country to replace its entire labor force with robots. All its citizens no longer needed to work. Production and manufacturing were entirely handled by machines. But strangely, the entire country suddenly vanished without a trace. After hearing the legend of this place, the traveler Kino decided to investigate it for herself. But when she arrived at the supposed location, she couldn't find a single clue about the country's existence. All she discovered was a villa nestled deep in the mountains. An elderly woman named Margaret claimed to be the robotic maid of the estate. She welcomed all travelers warmly, and Kino, who hadn't rested in days, decided to stay the night. While Margaret was preparing pastries in the kitchen, Kino accidentally stumbled upon a secret area inside the mansion. There, she found numerous robot limbs scattered around. It seemed to be a robotics research facility. Suddenly, Margaret appeared and told her that this was the very place where she had been created, and where she had been maintained and repaired by her creators. As robot maids, she said, their only duty was to fulfill any command given by their master. That evening, during dinner, Kino finally met the owner of the house. They greeted her warmly and invited her to dine. Margaret left the dining room shortly after, but then, the family's behavior turned bizarre. Though the food was fully prepared, they didn't take a single bite. Before Kino could finish eating, they dumped all the dishes straight into the trash. Later, Margaret asked them how the food she made had tasted. They insisted it was delicious. It was the strangest family Kino had ever encountered. Still, she was only a traveler, and she didn't want to interfere with how they lived. She tried asking them about the legend of the vanished country, but it was as if she had touched a nerve. Their expressions turned cold instantly, and then they stopped speaking altogether. Kino planned to fix her motorcycle and leave as soon as possible, but Margaret took her to a very special place. Beneath the lake, a massive structure lay submerged. No one knew exactly why it had sunk, but Kino had a feeling that this might be the very nation she'd been searching for. Since there was no one around to help repair the motorcycle, Kino decided to try fixing it herself. She managed to solve most of the issues, but the speedometer remained broken. Just then, Margaret suddenly showed up with a toolbox. To Kino's surprise, she fixed it with ease. Kino had a vague idea of what this might mean, but she said nothing. Suddenly, Margaret collapsed to the ground, joking that her oil might need changing. She could repair a motorcycle, but she couldn't fix her own body. Margaret said that even robots have a day when they break down for good, and that time had now come for her. The family gently picked up Margaret, but instead of taking her to a repair room, they laid her in bed. Margaret's life was quietly coming to an end, and they had no way to save her. All they could do was watch helplessly as she passed peacefully. In truth, Kino had already realized Margaret wasn't a robot, she was human. Kino attended her funeral. They buried Margaret, her husband, and son together. It turned out the three had been playing a long-running role-play game with Margaret. One of the men told Kino that their true identities were robots. Then they removed their heads to reveal their mechanical forms. Margaret had actually been the scientist who created them. She had long grown tired of war and devoted herself entirely to robotics research. She hoped to free humans from labor and to bring an end to senseless violence. It was a technology meant to benefit mankind, but the local factions at war feared what would happen if robots entered the battlefield. So they bombed Margaret's home. Her husband and child were killed, and Margaret, severely injured, lost all memory of the incident. After that, she came to believe that she was a robot created by humans, and so, the three robots naturally became her family. As civil war escalated in the country, it eventually collapsed. To ensure Margaret would never remember the pain of her past, the three robots built a dam and sank the entire nation beneath the lake. Kino had now learned the country's tragic history, and it was also time for her to leave. But the three robots wished to leave with her. They offered to be whatever she needed: family, friends, lovers, or servants. But Kino gently declined. She told them that robots didn't need to live for anyone else. They should go and start lives of their own, but they had been created to serve humans. Now, without that purpose, they had no reason to go on. In the end, they chose to sink into the cold lake to rest beside Margaret. The Margaret who created robots once lost reasons for living. Were these three robots who created a false family for her? Gave her the hope to continue living. Perhaps they were too human-like. After Margaret's death, they lost reasons to exist too. Perhaps we can't choose our own origins, but we can choose who we live for, who we persist for, This was a bizarre country. None of its citizens had jobs. They existed solely to build a sky-reaching tower. And if anyone asked them what the tower was for, they would all say they didn't know. They were just responsible for building it. As for its purpose, they had even less of a clue. Their ancestors had been working on it for over 230 years, and they had inherited that same responsibility. They worked tirelessly, day in and day out. One day, Kino arrived in this country. She, too, was curious about why they were building the tower, and what meaning it held for them. What puzzled her even more was how everyone worked without a single complaint. Kino tried to find a hotel to rest in, but after searching for a long while, she discovered that this country didn't have any hotels at all. With no other choice, Kino ended up sleeping in a storage room. But just then, a man secretly slipped into her room. Ever alert, Kino immediately subdued him and pointed her gun at him, demanding to know why he was there. Afraid of being mistaken for a thief, the man quickly explained himself. His name was Thomas. He was an odd one out among the nation's citizens. While everyone else worked hard, he was the only one who didn't. Thomas believed that this meaningless labor should have ended long ago. He had tried persuading others, but not a single person listened to him. When he heard that a traveler named Kino had arrived, he decided to find her. He wanted to ask Kino to take him away from this place. He didn't want to waste his entire life building a tower. But in the end, Kino didn't agree to help Thomas, because Thomas didn't have any special skills. He had no idea what he'd do after leaving the country. Kino feared that wandering blindly might get him killed. Still, she wanted to know from him why the people were building the tower, but Thomas said he didn't know either. The next day, Kino continued her exploration with that question in mind. She watched as countless vehicles streamed toward the tower. They moved like ants building a nest, constantly weaving in and out of the structure. Kino tried asking someone for information, but no one was willing to stop working and talk to her. Once again, she found no answers, but just as she was about to leave, a thunderous noise echoed across the country. Everyone immediately understood. The tower they had spent generations building was about to collapse, with the central section of the tower beginning to break apart. The structure that had taken 230 years to construct finally crumbled. That day, sandstorms swept across the land, but after the tower fell, no one looked disappointed. In fact, their faces were full of joy. An elderly man told Kino how happy he was. He felt fortunate to have witnessed the tower's collapse in his lifetime. It turned out they had all been waiting for the day the tower would fall. Kino asked what they planned to do next, and to her surprise, they said they would build a new tower. They knew full well that the tower would one day fall, yet they were still willing to keep building endlessly. In that moment, Kino began to understand their way of life. Kino once again turned down Thomas's request, but she told him maybe he could stay and work on producing those colorful bricks, or perhaps carve decorations into the bricks. That way, the tower they built would be even more beautiful. Kino's words sparked something in Thomas. He realized there were other kinds of work he could do. Instead of wandering the world without purpose, maybe it was better to stay and do a job that suited him. Soon, everyone began gathering to discuss plans for building the new tower, and it was time for Kino to leave. She had no intention of changing this country. She was just a witness. Some might think this place is strange, even insane. Why would they keep building a tower that's destined to collapse? But this story isn't about what's right or crazy. The citizens constructing the towering skyscraper appear to be engaged in meaningless repetitive labor. They are well aware that the tower will ultimately collapse, yet they persist for 230 years. Perhaps for them, the very process of this labor is the meaning itself. The collapse of the tower is not a failure but a new beginning. The daily toil of these citizens is akin to Kino's journey. The focus is not on the end goal, but on the entire process of participation and experience. Perhaps life was never meant to be about reaching a final destination. It's more like a tower, collapsing, then rising again. As long as each brick is laid with care, as long as we have seen it stand tall in the light, and can still smile when it falls, then the focus and hope along the way are the meaning itself. Kino's journey goes on, and your story is still being written. Take your time, every step counts. This country claimed to love peace more than any other, yet the streets were littered with fighter jets and bombs. Even tanks were treated as toys by children, casually played with like they were nothing. Kino, who had just arrived, couldn't understand how this country had earned the title of the most peaceful nation. Suddenly, A crisp gunshot rang out from under the bridge. An old man told her it was just a military training exercise. Tomorrow, they were going to launch a war. Kino couldn't understand. War was about to break out. So why was there not a trace of panic on the old man's face? The old man explained that warfare today was nothing like it used to be. He suggested Kino visit the National History Museum to learn more. Still confused, Kino made her way to the museum. She was personally greeted by the museum's curator, Dorothy. Dorothy began her explanation by recounting the origin of their nation. Long ago, this place was no more than a small tribe of 10 people. It was through generations of effort that the tribe eventually grew into a powerful nation. But as the country became stronger, it drew resentment from neighboring nations. A territorial dispute over a hilly region sparked a war that lasted over 100 years. As the conflict escalated, new weapons were introduced into battle, but in the end, neither side could overpower the other. The two countries became stuck in an endless cycle of warfare and ceasefires. But Kino couldn't help noticing the country seemed far too peaceful and orderly for one supposedly locked in perpetual war. Dorothy explained that this question would be answered in the next exhibit. However, the museum was closing for the day, and Kino would have to return tomorrow. The next day, Dorothy's assistant took Kino straight to the battlefield. Although it was technically a war between two nations, it didn't feel like a real war. The confrontation looked more like a sporting event. The two sides first used drones to mark a boundary line. Then, starting from that line, they launched surprise attacks on nearby tribal villages. Countless indigenous residents were caught in the bombardment. The two countries didn't fight each other directly. Instead, they both targeted the weaker neighboring tribes. To Kino, it was nothing more than a one-sided massacre masquerading as a game. In the end, the side that inflicted the most damage was declared the winner. After returning, Kino was once again greeted by Dorothy. Dorothy then showed her footage from past battles. She had once had a family and someone she loved, but her husband lost both legs because of the war. 3 of her sons enlisted, one after another, to seek revenge, and all 3 died on the battlefield. Her 4th and only surviving son disappeared after leaving home, never to be heard from again. Since then, Dorothy had spent every day wondering how to end these meaningless wars, but through her long search, she eventually realized that ending war completely was unrealistic. Human competition and desire were innate and unstoppable, so the only thing they could do was redirect the purpose of war. As it turned out, there were people on the opposing side who shared her belief. The two nations quickly reached an agreement. Soon after, they began waging this new kind of competitive war. Since then, no soldiers from either nation had been injured or killed, and both sides received massive funding from these operations. They continued this form of plunder without pause, and the nation grew wealthier and more stable as a result. But Kino questioned, what about the displaced, war-torn people who were caught in the crossfire? Dorothy replied that they only cared about whether their own soldiers were injured or not. The lives of people from other countries simply didn't matter to them. Kino didn't argue further. She didn't dare interfere with the nation's policies. But as she was leaving, she asked Dorothy, "Are you truly happy now?" Dorothy looked at the children playing near the hot springs. Then she said, "Maybe once you have children of your own and understand what happiness really feels like, you'll understand my answer." On the road, Kino kept reflecting on Dorothy's words, but then she noticed something unusual. The road was lined with many abandoned travelers' suitcases. Deep in the forest, a group of native villagers suddenly appeared. They were preparing to capture Kino. Even though they knew Kino wasn't a resident of that country, they had no one else to take their anger out on except travelers. Just as Dorothy had said, hatred never truly disappears, it simply changes targets. Seeing that negotiation was useless, Kino had no choice but to draw her handgun. At the sound of gunfire, the villagers immediately panicked. That familiar sound struck fear deep into their hearts. They scattered in every direction, terrified of being shot. But Kino was still thinking about Dorothy's question, and until she had someone in her life to care for, she knew it would be hard to truly understand that answer. Still, she believed this. Peace should never come at the cost of others, nor should it be used as an excuse to cover up violence. Human innovation in warfare is not progress, it's the regression of civilization, a loss of direction driven by desire and hatred.